This is Richie Venton, the Scottish Socialist Party Trades Union Organiser. Most people at the minute are probably preoccupied with the election of Donald Trump as the next president of the US. I want to take up a couple of the implications and warnings for this country that arise from that election. Now, first of all, it has to be said that Trump is a billionaire who pretends to be an outsider, a bigot, a racist, a misogynist, a convicted felon, a shameless narcissist who has been elected despite all those things, and the question arises why. It's fundamentally because of the record of the Biden-Harris administration. The Democrats and the Republicans, in reality, amount to a one-party state in the US, one capitalist party with two different factions, and then groupings inside each of them. Both of them fundamentally stand up for big business and the billionaires. That's been proven once again during this election campaign in one simple fact. It's record spending in this election of about $16 billion and is pretty evenly divided between the two capitalist parties, the Democrats and Republicans. Billionaires have contributed to a level never seen before to the election funds of each candidate. For example, in the year and a half since January 2023, then billionaires have donated just very short of $1 billion to the Harris campaign of the Democrats and about $400 million to Trump's campaign. So much for his claim to be an outsider when, of course, he's a billionaire himself. In fact, one other simple fact, at least 83 billionaires donated to Harris and 52 to Trump. Those with over $100 billion in wealth, what are called centibillionaires, include Bill Gates and Michael Bloomberg, who supported Harris, and then the infamous Elon Musk, who supported Trump. There you get a picture of the fact that the working class of America are not represented by either of these parties. And of course, it's the track record of Biden and Harris in government that has driven many voters away from voting Democrat. The fact that there's record inequality, that 2/3 of the people live from paycheck to paycheck, that there's record inflation in things like food, housing, drugs, prescriptions. There's no provision of sick leave or health care for most of the population. And it's reckoned that something like a quarter of workers, 39 million of them, are on what they call low wages of £13 an hour, £27,000 a year, including a third of black and Latino workers. So it's no wonder that the Democrats have lost the vote of not just huge chunks of the white working class, but also now the Latino and black working class. But Trump is a false alternative, an entirely reactionary and false alternative that will do nothing for the living standards of working class people. In fact, the likelihood is that some of his favourite policies will exacerbate their problems. To take one example, he's threatened import tariffs of 60% on all goods coming in from China and 10% tariffs on imports from every other country, which inevitably means price rises for the American working class, but also will slow down the world economy. And that has implications here in Scotland and Britain, because we've just had the Labour budget, which is heavily reliant on this myth, this fiction, this dream of a turbocharged growth in the economy, which will then lead to all these bountiful handouts from the Labour government that they kind of half promised. But let's briefly highlight some of the features of the Labour budget, and then for me the key question of what should the Scottish Government do and what can we learn from the way in which the failures of one capitalist party in America, the Democrats in government, leads to a far-right election victory for the likes of the obnoxious Donald Trump. Now, the Labour budget, with great bells and bugles and flashing lights, pretended that it was going to tax the rich to some extent in order to improve public services. But when you demolish all the fog and cut through the fog that was created in the budget day itself, then a few stark facts emerge. First of all, that even their measure of increase in national insurance contributions from the employers is not quite so progressive a taxation of the bosses as it might superficially appear. Because even their chosen oracle, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is quoted religiously like an icon by the Labour government, even they have calculated that 76% of the £45 billion that allegedly raises for public funds will actually be taken back off workers through a combination of wage cuts and price increases. So that, to start with, indicates there's not really a progressive measure, because after all, when you just tinker around the edges of a capitalist system, a system that relies on profits being absolutely untouchable, being sacrosanct, that is the consequence. The working class pay the price of even a measure that on the surface seems quite a progressive one. We see the fact that they've increased the minimum wage for workers of 21 and above from $11.44 now to $12.21. Now, of course, for anybody swimming in a sea of unpaid bills, that's a welcome increase of just under £1 an hour. But it's nothing compared to what's needed. After all, for a couple of years or more, not just the Scottish Socialist Party, but also the entire trade union movement in the form of the TUC has demanded an immediate £15 an hour to deal with the fundamental cost of living, the bare minimum required in order to cope with the cost of living. And it's hardly asking the earth when the SSP advocates a minimum wage that's based on the formula of 2/3 male median earnings, when the average FTSE 100 chief executive is on £4.2 million of an income this year. That keeps it in perspective. And even the welcome small steps in terms of slightly increased expenditure on health and education are nothing compared to what's needed. In the case of education in schools in England, for example, then one of the teachers' unions have quite rightly pointed out that £6.7 billion of an increased investment is nothing compared to the loss of £40 billion since 2010 alone in school capital expenditure. And in the case of the health service, bringing it up to an increase for the next 2 years of 3.4% doesn't even reach or match the average increase per annum every single year on average from 1955 up until recent times of 3.6% of expenditure in health. So no, it's not a budget that's going to be bountiful for working class people. In fact, when all the different measures are calculated, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has worked out that the average household will actually be worse off to the tune of £770 each and every single year of the 5 years of the Labour government. And that's not even allowing for the potential impact of the election of Trump, the tariff war that he's about to conduct, and the likelihood that that will have the effect of cutting down trade, cutting down world production, cutting down the prospects of growth further for the likes of the British economy. So no, Labour has not solved the problems of the working class. We still live in a grotesquely unequal society where poverty is rampant amidst plenty. So what should the SNP government do in response to that in this budget on the 4th of December? Now, I've issued the call on behalf of the Scottish Socialist Party in recent times that instead of just following the path of Labour and bowing down to Labour's new version of austerity, that the Scottish Government should instead do what the election slogan often says, which is to stand up for Scotland. And which Scotland do we mean? I mean the Scottish working class and even the lower middle class in Scotland, not the two families in Scotland, the two richest families, who have more wealth between them than 1.1 million Scottish citizens. A grotesque example of the inequality in this country. No, we want a people's budget to be set. And what would that mean in practice? For a start off, regardless of how much money has been conceded in Barnett consequentials and so on, which is still very unclear, with Labour claiming initially that they would give an additional 3.4 billion next year, 25-26, to Scotland. Still not answering the question, does that allow for the £500 million extra in national insurance contributions for the Scottish public sector, like health, local government, etc.? No matter how much is conceded, or how little compared to their claims in headlines, then the Scottish Government should take a few simple, bold steps that would begin to cut through the fog and show that no, Labour is not a radical alternative and that we need far better for the Scottish people. For example, they should immediately reinstate the universal nature of winter fuel payments for Scotland's pensioners, instead of doing what the SNP have previously done, which is to say we have no alternative to follow the path of Westminster and means test this, which means that 900,000 pensioners in Scotland are deprived of £200 to £300 this winter, which will mean premature deaths from hypothermia for thousands of people, a tragic consequence of such an attitude, and would only cost them buttons, £160 million, to resurrect the universal nature of winter fuel payments. It would appear right now that the Scottish Socialist Party is the only party in Scotland that stands for universalism when it comes to different types of benefits. But we demand that the Scottish Government change their stance and implement full payment to every pensioner of the winter fuel payments, which, by the way, shouldn't even be a necessary benefit because it's the product of rotten low pensions and exorbitant energy bills because of profiteering by privatised energy companies and the rotten state pension in this country, the lowest in Europe. They should also take the step immediately to reverse their previous stance and take the step of scrapping the two-child benefits cap, which now still continues to deprive at least 90,000 Scottish kids of food and income for their families. They should compensate the 335,000 WASPI women, the women against state pension inequality, those women born in the 1950s, robbed of tens of thousands of their pensions, one day in every 13 minutes without even an apology, let alone financial compensation. The Scottish Socialist Party, at its conference last weekend, came out with a unique policy, in terms of any other party, of demanding compensation of at least £10,000 for every WASPI woman, without delay, without any means testing, and for the Scottish Government to do that and then vociferously and forcefully campaign and demand that the funds be given back from Westminster, which inflicted this atrocity on women in the first place. So, also, for the working class in general, instead of just accepting the paltry £12.21 adult minimum wage, and still 20% less than that as the minimum wage for younger workers aged 18 to 21, instead of just accepting that and acquiescing in continued poverty pay, the Scottish Government instead should declare an immediate Scottish minimum wage of £15 an hour for all those aged 16 or over. Now, the objection might arise, but the statutory minimum wage is a reserved matter for Westminster, and that's true. But the Scottish Government can get round that by implementing the so-called living wage and making it £15 an hour right across every section of the public sector, which employs on its own 605,000 workers in Scotland, a huge section of the workforce. Plus, they could use contract compliance, whereby no private company would be granted a public sector contract unless they pay at least the minimum of £15 an hour to their workers. That one measure would be a huge beacon to working class people to say, we can be different in Scotland. We're not prepared to continue and just accept Labour's austerity, let alone previous Tory austerity. We're going to take a different path. Another couple of planks of the people's budget for Scotland that we're advocating as socialists is that they should nationalise Grangemouth without any compensation to that shark multi-billionaire, Jim Ratcliffe, who is currently in the process of dumping directly 500 refinery workers and indirectly about 2,800 workers in the area on the scrap heap. The government should instead take it over into public ownership and invest in an alternative plan of green production led by the expertise of the workforce themselves. The government should also launch measures on housing, one of the biggest crises in Scottish society right now. They should launch immediate retrofits, including insulation and so on, of every home free of charge, generating jobs and the income tax that would flow from that by hiring huge teams of council workers to go into districts, district by district systematically to retrofit homes, and also start the process of building 100,000 eco-friendly council houses at genuinely affordable rent. The Scottish Government have an opportunity to be different. Are they prepared to take up that opportunity? They should genuinely tax the rich. They should put far higher taxation rates on the very wealthy minority, including particularly those on £100,000 a year or more of an income, and levy a wealth tax on every millionaire. I've calculated that if there was even the modest 5% wealth tax on all millionaires resident in Scotland, it would generate roughly £22 billion to then be spent on health, education, fire services and other essentials at local government level, for example. But the one other point I will make in terms of what the Scottish Government should do by way of a people's budget is the one simple measure above all that they've got the powers to do and that they should do and which would be widely popular, which is to say the council tax is unfair, it's regressive, it doesn't raise the funds required for local jobs and services. It should be abolished, not tampered with. It shouldn't be just deodorised to make it smell a bit less nasty, but it should be abolished immediately and replaced with the Scottish service tax, which the SSP has advocated for well over 20 years. A tax based on income, where the rich pay far more, 75% of households would pay less, and we've calculated that on the most recently available figures from the government, that for 2021-22, that it would literally double the funds for Scotland's 32 local councils to £5.3 billion by taxing the very rich, in particular those over £100,000 and above. So there's a choice facing the Scottish Government. They can either tag along and imitate the actions of a Labour austerity regime, or take a different path and stand up for the Scottish people, the working class and lower middle class, by taking measures to tax the rich and take wealth into public hands and give our people a decent future. And the warning from America, to conclude, is that unless such progressive and socialistic measures are taken, then people will become increasingly outraged at the inequality, the poverty and the utter failure of mainstream political parties to do anything about it, because they're in hock to the billionaire and millionaire class. We've seen the way in which working class Americans of all ethnicities and genders have turned in many cases to vote for this obnoxious reactionary billionaire bigot Donald Trump. And the danger in this country is that given that Labour is going to fail the aspirations of working class people for change compared to 14 years of Toryism, They're going to fail to do that. And if the SNP government likewise fails to meet the needs and hopes and wishes of working class people in this country, then the danger is that the likes of Farage and Reform will give false promises and blame the wrong people, will blame immigration and so on, ethnic minorities, instead of blaming the billionaire and millionaire class, which of course Farage himself is part of, and could gain some kind of traction. And that's why a socialist alternative is so critical. That's why the Scottish Socialist Party is determined to unite with other trade unionists and other progressive people to fight for a people's budget, for taxation of the rich, for public ownership and a redistribution of wealth, not more of the same capitalist austerity, whether that's under Tories, Labour or the SNP.